Hi, welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Anne Simpson. She's both a poet and a novelist and also one of the winners of the Journey Prize, and she's here today. Her latest book actually is called Canterbury Beach. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be here, Leslie. Yeah.
Now, which came first, the poetry or the fiction?
The fiction, in fact. I was working for a long time on the fiction, a few years, and I was revising, and then the poetry came in the midst of that.
Does one actually improve the other as you go back and forth from one form of writing? Do you learn a thing that you then take back into the next?
Yeah, I think you do. What I was finding was that things from the poetry would filter into the fiction and vice versa. And I think when you're writing a long, sustained narrative piece like a novel, little bits of poetry can get in there. You can kind of flatten it down and try not to get too flowery, but I think on the whole there's little bits of poetry that can work its way in.
I think I notice that sometimes when I'm reading fiction writers, you know, Michael Ondaatje or something, or, you know, maybe a bit of your own, where I see, there's a poetic phrase that, you know, maybe she pulled right out of a poem, or the brain kind of kicked into poetic mode for that instant instead of just, you know, the narrative that goes along.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, people who do both poetry and fiction, I think you can really see it.
Yeah. The volume of poetry was called Light Falls Through You, which is a great title for a book. Where did that come from?
It came from one of the poems in the book.
Yeah. And what does it refer to?
Well, it refers to, in that particular poem, I wanted to get at the notion of grief, in fact, and it was a nice, well, it was a way of dealing with the fact that one is transparent with grief, and so the idea of light falling through you.
Yes. What should a poem do?
Well, what did Emily Dickinson say? I think you'd probably be able to tell me better.
Oh, I know. I've heard you have Marion Moore and the sort of different things down through the years. What about your own?
Well, I like what... let me go back to Emily Dickinson for a moment, because she said that a poem should take the top of your head off, or words to that effect. And I think when I read a really good poem, that kind of thing happens. It's I have to sit with it for a while, and I have to allow it to get in there. Once it's in there, something really happens.
Yes. How do you know when you have it right, if you're creating the poem yourself?
Sometimes I don't know, and sometimes I do, and I try to think of it as a kind of circular thing. You know, it's the old unity, beginning, middle, and end. In a narrative poem, that's easy enough, because you know when you've gotten to the end, the closure of the narrative. But in a lyric poem, it's a little harder to tell, and usually it's that you've got a line or two that tend to wrap it together, not in a conclusive way, not in a way that is too concise or too succinct, but in a way that just perfectly says what you've been saying all the way through the poem, but slightly differently. A little bit like Shakespeare's couplets in the sonnets.
And can you feel it in your gut?
Yeah, you can feel it. It's visceral. You can feel it.
Interesting. Music, I think, plays a part in your poetry from the poems that I've read, and in many poets certainly make use of the music of the language. How does that feel for language and its musicality fit into the way you write?
Oh, I think that it's true that I think of poetry in an oral way, as though I were speaking it aloud. And in fact, that's one of the joys of poetry, is to actually go out there and read it. I'm not a musician, but I do like to sing, and that the feeling of rhythm, I think, gets in there whether you're aware of it or not. And one of the things I'm really interested in is the fact that lately, what I've noticed in a lot of poets is this decision to move away from lyric, musical poetry into something that's more prosy, and a little less musical.
Yes.
And so I'm fascinated by that. Why is that? Why
The
is
prose
it?
poem.
Yeah,
Gee, it looks
yeah,
just
the
like a
prose poem.
paragraph.
Uh-huh.
Oh, but it's a poem. Yeah,
Yes,
we have
yeah.
this funny thing about what a poem can do and can't do. And of course, a poem can do anything at all, can't it?
It can, and that's the beauty of it. I think when you're writing a poem, when I'm writing a poem, probably when you're writing a poem too, there's a feeling of play, and there's a feeling that you can really move around and experiment and do just about anything you want. And that's the thing that I like the best about poetry.
Yes. Would you read one for us, please?
Sure.
This is from your book, Light Falls Through You.
This is a short one at the beginning called Descent, and there's a short epigraph at the beginning. The Hector brought emigrants to Nova Scotia in the 18th century. Water isn't treacherous, nor is the descent into it, made easy by a plank held at an angle on the ship's rail, so a small girl wrapped in a length of flannel could drop quickly. In the silence after her body slid on the wood and the brief splash, I recalled nothing of her, not the undulating terrain of her skin, not the sleeping animal of her hand in mine, not even the cleft in her chin, which I used to touch, marveling.
Thank you, Anne Simpson reading. Now, this volume of poetry contains a number of instances where you're writing about victims, dealing with difficult subjects like Rwanda and the Montreal Massacre. Why tackle such difficult kinds of issues within poetry?
It's true. I think I went at it without really knowing that I was doing that, because it is a poetry book that has to do with grief, and that would be a theme running all the way through it, I would say. What I didn't realize was that the poetry that I write is somehow political. And I think in writing this first book, which came together more or less in a short period of time, I began to see that I did want to speak for people who couldn't speak for themselves, the victims of the massacre in Rwanda. And, you know, here I am doing it, and I'm white, I'm not Rwandan, you know, I'm none of those things, but I feel that a poet can speak for those who have crimes perpetrated upon them, and you know, there's no voice, they're voiceless.
Yes, and that is a very political act, although, as you say, you may not have seen yourself as being a political activist on that
not
level.
at all.
But maybe that's an important job of the writer, is giving voice to the victims, giving voice to those who don't have voices.
Yes, I think it is. You're right.
Now, I first came across your work with the story Dreaming Snow. It was co-winner of the Journey Prize a couple years ago. And part of that concerns Arctic exploration. Is that a subject that's close to your heart?
Oh, it is. Yeah, definitely. And I was just reading Arctic Dreams by Barry Lopez, just getting into that. And he talks a little bit about the aspect of desire, the desire to explore, the desire to go out there, and that the imagination is fundamental in this, going out and exploring. And I thought that must be what drew me to polar exploration in the beginning, that notion of, oh, it's imaginative territory. You know,
I'm just guessing, but you haven't gone to the North Pole yourself.
No, I haven't, no. But I imagine it, you know. I think, oh yeah, I could go out there and be Fridtjof Nansen.
Tell me who it was again. This was a 19th century explorer. Was
Right.
he Norwegian?
Norwegian, and
Yes.
his name was Fridtjof Nansen. And he was quite an interesting fellow, because he was a scientist, he was an artist, he was a statesman eventually for Norway. Very interesting ideas. And in fact, his trip to the Arctic was to test a scientific theory of his that the ice in fact drifted. So they started out in Siberia, just north of Siberia, and then the Fram, their boat, was stuck in the ice and drifted for years back towards the north of Norway. And
I do remember something about
yeah.
that, right? And this all led to something about the Northwest Passage, I suppose. Did it finding a passage or figuring out which way the waters were running or something like that?
Yeah, I think he was interested in that as well. But
Yeah.
and they did make a foray towards the North Pole, but never did make it from the ship. it's just so interesting that it was one of those very successful expeditions, that everything turned out right.
Yes, and that's
And
very unusual in the history of the
it is.
North and the explorers who went there.
It's true, yeah. And that says something, I think, about the leadership of an expedition, as well as, you know, everything going right. They were lucky.
He wasn't a Franklin, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Is this a Canadian thing, this identity tied in with the Arctic being somehow part of our imagination, that big expanse up there, emptiness?
Oh, I do
diversity?
think so. I think we're drawn towards that. And it could be the that Zen-like quality of what's out there. You know, it seems like it's nothing, and yet there's so very much going on in the Arctic. And yeah, I think Canadians are drawn that way, just imaginatively. You know, even if they haven't gone there, even if they haven't done any rafting along the Nahanni River or something like that. You know, I think we are drawn to that place that is so wide, so vast, so seemingly empty.
Yeah. What other sort of things connect with your imagination from real life before it becomes poetry or fiction? What sort of things do you see, or what places stay with you and you know that you're going to bring that back in your work?
Well, just in terms of landscape, I think the landscape of Nova Scotia is something that comes up again and again. I'm drawn to it in a really special way. So that's one of the things that I guess comes into my writing. But also, what I need in order to write is I need to be able to see art. So I need to be able to see shows and often
Paintings. You work
paintings.
from paintings. You see a painting and that
It
sets
might
you
be a
up for
painting of-
imaginative territory?
Yes, it might be a painting, might be a drawing. It might be, and lately this is what's been triggering things, an installation of some kind, so quite experimental stuff. And I think that's because I see poetry as being so experimental. You know, you can go any way you want.
Yes.
And so a place like the Power Plant Gallery in Toronto is great. I go in there and I think I've got enough for months now to live on.
Where did you grow up? You're not originally from Nova Scotia.
I grew up near Hamilton, across the bay from Stelco and Dofasco, and so all the plants. I grew up in Burlington, Ontario.
Anything about that landscape that stays with you in your poetry?
Oh,
and your
yes.
characters?
Oh, I didn't expect it, but the last long poem in Light Falls Through You is called Altarpiece. And as I was growing up, there was a golf course very close to where we lived. This in direct contrast to Stelco and Dofasco across the bay. And this man-made landscape became something that was, so much a part of the poem. And the other thing that I was thinking of at the time was an altarpiece by Grunwald, a German artist in approximately the Renaissance period. So I was thinking of both these things.
That's an interesting crossover between art and literature. Canterbury Beach is your first novel, and I'm wondering about what the progression is for a writer to arrive at that point where you write the long narrative.
Oh yeah, it's so different than writing poetry. I think poetry is nice because it's little bursts. The novel, when you're writing your first one, as you would well know, I think you're reinventing it. You know intellectually how a novel should go. You know that you've got to develop the characters, you know you've got to work on the dialogue, you know the story has to progress in such a way and, in a sense, be circular, you know, somehow come back to its beginnings, or at least lead the reader around. And so, as I was doing it, I was thinking, oh, well, I know how to write a novel, but I don't know how to write a novel at all. And so I had to learn, I think, as I was going. I had to really learn. And what I did learn was to dig very deep. You know, you can't just assume that the story has been told once you've done a first draft. Then you have to go back again and dig deeper at those places where things could really start to happen.
Yes.
So that's what I had to learn.
Now, somewhere in there, at least one of the chapters is a story. It had been published as a story first, is that right? Or were a couple of the chapters that way?
Yeah, I'd had the idea for Canterbury Beach, and I knew that I was going to have tales within the novel, because I wanted it to be very much like the Canterbury Tales, but a modernized version of the Canterbury Tales. So yes, there was a story that was published early on, but at the same time I was thinking of the whole thing as a novel. So I guess I had already incorporated it into the novel in my mind.
Yes.
But I did publish it as a short story.
You already had the eye on the big picture.
Yeah.
We're going to take a short break right now, and we'll be back in a minute with my guest, Anne Simpson, right after this. Welcome back to Off the Page. My guest today is Anne Simpson. And Anne, I'd like to talk about this new novel of yours called Canterbury Beach. And just you mentioned before we took our break there is a connection to Chaucer here. Mm-hmm. Canterbury Tales, was that an important work of literature for you?
Oh, it was. I don't often teach. I work at St. Francis Xavier University, and I don't often teach there, but I did teach a night class some years ago. And as I was teaching it, I wanted to make it really relevant to the students. And I thought, you could do the same old, but how do you make it relevant? And so we began to picture it in terms of people in an airport or people in a bus terminal, that kind of thing. And as I was doing this with the students, I began to see the potential there. And I thought, well, you could revisit those tales. They're wonderful. They run the gamut of human emotions from kind of lyrical love right through to something very funny and bawdy. And so Chaucer is very adept at being able to move around.
That's what I always liked about Chaucer. I wasn't happy when I saw it on my reading list first in college, but once I got into it, I realized that there were some dirty stories there. It was kind of,
Right.
interesting and fun, and I didn't know you were allowed to do that in literature courses in college. Now, do you borrow anything from the form of the Canterbury Tales? Anything else that comes into your novel?
I think it would be mostly the structure, just moving in terms of tales, moving along and showing the larger story that way. Now, with Chaucer, I think the Pilgrims were to tell 2 stories on their way to Canterbury from London and 2 stories on the way back. And the work is actually a poem, but it's unfinished. So Canterbury Tales is it's interesting that way. But you do see the larger picture with the tales to some extent. You know that, you see Geoffrey Chaucer himself as the sort of bumbling country bumpkin, and you see Harry Bailey, the host. And so there are wonderful things happening between people. And I guess the way that I was influenced was I really wanted to do something that was humane, that talked about a group of people and allowed them to interact in some way. And at first I thought, how am I going to do this, a journey, what will I do? And first I had a group of women in a car, and to me that wasn't enough. It wasn't balanced enough. There were no men in the picture.
Had to get some men in there.
Yeah. So
they probably mucked things up though, right, as soon as you got the men in?
Well, women and men both. So I thought a family, that's
And a
really
pilgrimage of sorts is taking place?
And a
in your novel?
pilgrimage, but it's a holiday destination. They go to a beach. They go to a cottage at a beach. And it's so different than the other kind of destination, which was truly a holy destination.
Right. Now, the novel deals very much with marriage and family. And I think that it's not a very easy fictional world to do well because of the complexity of relationships. Why did you want to tackle that?
I think I wanted to, just in terms of being inspired by Chaucer, I think I wanted to go back to those themes that he was so interested in. As you talk about marriage, and a key one is love, and another is just how do we relate to one another, and can we be successful at that? And so, yes, it's very complex, but I think maybe I'm drawn to that, just relationships and how things work out, and do they work out? And I'm also very interested in why people might be destructive, and do they have the potential to be creative, particularly in that wonderful net, which is family. So many of us can be destructive in our families, but do we then come back? Can we be creative? Can we tie things together?
Yes. I noticed that one of the scenes in the novel takes place traveling through the Tantramar Marsh. I wondered if that was one of those special landscapes for you.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Very unique place.
It is unique.
Can you describe it a little bit?
Oh, it's flat, but yet it's not flat. It's sort of, there are hummocky bits, and there's a bit of a rise in the middle. And I think it's the the scope, the space, again, it's a little bit like the Arctic landscape we were talking about before. What is one drawn to? A space which seems to be empty and yet is not. And that is, the Tantramar marshes are so spiritual in that sense. There's a lot of sky, there's a lot of water, and then there's grass. And then there's the history of it too, with the Acadians
Yes.
making their dikes there, and the land, the soil being so good for farming.
And it does have a profound effect on anybody traveling through that expanse between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. It's a great place. The dark sheep character, the guy with more problems maybe than the rest in your novel, his name is Garnet. Introduce us to him, if you would.
Garnet, I was talking before about we have the potential to be destructive, and Garnet has been all through his life quite destructive. And he is a character that I really was drawn to. I found him one of the more interesting ones because he doesn't do the usual thing. He doesn't do the conventional thing. But can a maverick like that be part of a community, a small community, which is, in this case, family? And so as he's drawn into the family, he hasn't seen them in a long time, and as he's drawn in, he sort of sets things off. He kind of detonates things, and everyone feels the effect of it. And yet, in the end, I think things do work out. Things do, there's a feeling in which family can come together and forgive what's happened. So I like that about him. I like the fact that he was both these things. That
Even though he causes people a lot of pain.
He does cause a lot of pain. But the parents, Verna and Alistair, are willing to love him throughout. It's the siblings, you know, his brothers and sisters, they're the ones who have difficulty with him.
Verna and Alistair, they're a very stable couple, are they?
They're pretty stable. Verna perhaps is more imaginative than Alistair, but Alistair is very steady and very thorough and very careful. And the wonderful thing about him is that he loves his wife and his children so deeply.
And maybe you could read a short excerpt from Canterbury Beach.
Sure, I'll read from Fortune. Alistair had always had good luck, as his grandmother had told him. He'd had everything he wanted. The sun, going down, touched the moving water. The man who had been walking along the shore was retracing his steps. But Alistair's good luck wasn't something he could give away. The man walked up and over a ridge of sand through the feathers of dune grass. He stooped and picked up a soda can, pocketed it, and continued past Alistair up the boardwalk. There was nothing Alistair could do for Garnet, nothing Verna could do. He made his way back along the silvery boards, past the poison ivy and the wild roses. But he couldn't just stand by and watch. He came to the end of the boardwalk and looked back. There was nothing except spruce trees and the slightly uneven boards narrowing in the distance.
It's a very interesting tale that evolves there. What sort of writer are you? Are you slow and careful, or do you make a lot of mistakes and go back and fix things up?
I make a lot of mistakes. Yeah, I write fast when I write. I do make mistakes, and I find that the hardest job, because it's the most exacting job, is the job of revising, going back and as I said before, digging deeper, going further with the story. I've often heard it said that novels have a lot of promise at the beginning, but they don't necessarily sustain that in the end. And that could be because we get so many chances at the beginning to go over it. The end is closer to the finish line of things. And so maybe we don't go over it in the way that we could as writers. And so I think in future, the task I'll set for myself is to really work at the ending to make sure that it is as gripping and as interesting as it can be, because essentially we're trying to tell a good story when we write a novel.
Yes. My guest today has been Anne Simpson, and we'll be back with her right after this. My guest today has been Anne Simpson. Anne, what's your day job?
Oh gosh, I work a little bit at the Writing Center at St. Francis Xavier University.
You help students with their writing.
I help students with their writing. And I get the summers off to write, so it's ideal.
Well, I thank you for coming down from Antigonish and joining us on the show today.
Thank you, Leslie.
And thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.